Welcome back. In the previous lecture, we understood reading from the databases is not as straightforward as reading from any other files. As a part of this lecture, we'll understand how do we read from the databases and create the data frame in Spark. Let's get started. As we know, to read from a database, it is not straightforward. What are the different steps we need to follow to read from the database and create a data frame? Let us try to look at that one by one. To read and write from the databases, we need two things. The first and foremost thing is we need to have a JDBC driver. We need a JDBC driver for that database. Second thing is we need to provide the jar itself. Using the jar, we can connect to the database from which we want to read the data and create a data frame. As we understood, we got to provide the driver on the Spark class path. Second thing is we need to provide the jar file itself. We need to provide these two things to connect to the databases through JDBC. Then how do we read the data from SQL databases? We got to specify the format. You know which is the format? We'll see that in a bit. And we need to provide the different options as well. Like the format would be either JDBC or ODBC depending on from which database we are trying to read the data from. And the second thing is we need to provide the driver and the URL and the table name. So, the format we need to provide, these are the different options also we need to provide to read the data from databases. As we have different options in CSV and other file formats, we do have options when we want to read the data from different databases. Some of the options are URL, DB table. Database may have multiple tables, so we need to provide the table name as well. Sometimes we may have to provide the query itself as a table name, which we will see as a part of the query push down lecture. And some of the options are like driver. All these options are there as a part of the JDBC data source. Once we provide all the options like the driver, URL, path and all those things, it is very important to check the connection to the database itself, whether the connection is working properly or not. Because as you know, in the big data world, we would have installed a big data ecosystem in one particular server. You may want to connect to a database which is not there in the same server. During that time, you need to ensure that whatever the URL, whatever the path you have given is proper or not. How do we do that? By checking the connection. It depends on the project. Sometimes you may not need that because it is already connected. Sometimes you do need it. You please check with the Hadoop admin or Big Data admin to see whether the database connectivity is there or not. To check the connection to the database, you may have to import the Java SQL driver manager and say get connection to the URL. If the connection is there, whether it is able to establish a connection with the database or not. If not, it will throw an error message. Now that we understood, first we got to provide the class path, the driver itself, that is the jar file for the driver. Second thing is we got to provide the different options and the format and then test the connection to the database. Next thing is we can go ahead and create the data frame itself. Pay attention here, as I indicated earlier, it is not as straightforward as reading from a file. To create a data frame, by reading a data from database, we got to provide all these things. This is, as we know, data frame name, we already know that. This is as usual our Spark session and the same data frame reader. Then in the format we got to provide the JDBC here. As you know, in earlier lectures we understood we can provide the CSV, we can provide the JSON depending on where from we want to read the data. After that we got to provide all these options. This is a driver and the URL, a connection URL. So pay attention here, this connection URL depends on which database you are connecting to. In this case, I am trying to connect to MySQL database and you should know where it is installed, IP of the system in which your database is installed. If you don't know, please check with your admin, and also the port number your database is connected to. In the end, in this particular option, you got to provide the database as well, because you may have different databases. So you got to provide the database, you got to provide the IP address or domain name, and you got to provide the port in which your database is installed and the database name itself. After that, table from which you are trying to get the data. Next thing is we got to provide the authentication parameters also, like what is the username from which you can log into the database you are trying to connect to, and what is the password of the database. All these options need to be provided to read a data from any databases. Now we have created the data frame from a database. This is the data frame, we have created it from a database. Can we start working on this data frame as we have started working on the data frame which we have created from other sources like semi-structured and unstructured? Yes, we can. Once the data frame is created, data frame is a data frame. Whether you are creating that from a semi-structured format or you are creating it from a structured format. Once you create the data frame by reading the data from database, you can query on that, you can transformation on the different columns depending upon the requirement of the project, and also you can perform many joins also as a part of that. So nothing different. Once the data frame is created, we can perform all these operations on the data frame. One of the very important aspect is, as we know, databases do have schema. That is one of the very important aspect of the database, where until and unless you create a schema, you will not be able to create the tables itself and load the data into them. Now that databases have schema already, what Spark does is it gathers information about schema from the table itself, and after that it maps that to the Spark data types. That is also one of the important aspect. You need not really worry about defining the schema when you are trying to create the data frame by reading the data from a database. Wonderful. Let us look at all these things as a part of the practical session. Thank you.